The Disturbing Disappearance of the Franklin Expedition. In 1845, two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, vanished into the Arctic ice while attempting to chart the fabled Northwest Passage, leaving behind one of the most haunting maritime mysteries in history. Led by Sir John Franklin, a well-meaning but controversial figure with a history of disastrous polar ventures, the expedition was equipped with the most advanced naval technology of its time: steam engines repurposed from locomotives, iron-reinforced hulls, desalination systems, and even one of the earliest daguerreotype cameras ever sold. With 129 men on board and high hopes of eternal glory, the ships were last seen by a pair of whalers off the coast of Baffin Bay. What followed was more than just disappearance, it was complete erasure. Over a century passed with no clear answers, only the occasional relic: a fork, a uniform button, human remains gnawed by starvation, and scraps of notes frozen in time. Later Inuit testimonies and modern discoveries pointed to a grim truth. The ships had become locked in ice near King William Island, the crews slowly succumbing to scurvy, lead poisoning, and eventually desperation so profound it may have led to cannibalism. Franklin died early in the ordeal, and leadership fell to Captain Francis Crozier, who, with the remaining survivors, attempted a hopeless march southward across an unforgiving wasteland. When the wrecks of both ships were finally discovered in the 2010s, eerily preserved beneath the ice, they brought with them not resolution, but a chilling confirmation that even the greatest imperial ambition was no match for the wrath of nature. The Franklin expedition, once hailed as a noble quest for knowledge, now stands as a stark reminder of how exploration can teeter into tragedy and how the Arctic keeps its secrets well. The Voyage Into Ice. How the Franklin expedition was doomed from the start. The Arctic is a place where life pauses, where snow covers the land year-round, the ocean turns solid, and the sun may not rise or set for months at a time. It was into this bleak and frozen wilderness that HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sailed on May 19, 1845, departing from Greenhithe near London with 134 men, a ship's cat, a monkey named Jacko, and a dog named Neptune. They carried nearly 16,000 tins of food, an untested invention at the time, along with 2 tons of tobacco, 7,500 liters of liquor, a small library of 12,000 books, and even theater costumes and sports equipment. The expedition was more than just scientific. It was a mobile society ready for isolation. After stops in Scotland and Greenland, where 5 men were discharged due to illness, the remaining 129 crew members wrote final letters home, basked in fleeting warmth, and prepared to enter the ice. By July 12th, they pushed into the Northwest Passage. 2 whaling ships were the last to see them as they vanished into Lancaster's Sound. They would never return. What followed was over 150 years of silence, confusion, and slowly emerging horror. Ice clogged even summer routes, and the brass propeller steam engines on the Erebus and Terror, hailed as cutting edge, were underpowered and nearly useless, capable of just 4 knots, with fuel for only 12 days. The technology, once seen as triumph, had become psychological comfort at best. The ships made modest progress, about 800 kilometers, before becoming trapped in ice near Beechy Island by late 1845. There, they constructed shelter with canvas coverings and snow-packed walls, settling in to endure their first Arctic winter. But death came early. 3 men were buried that season. At first, the suspected cause was pneumonia, but decades later, autopsies revealed something more sinister. All 3 had extreme levels of lead in their bodies, far beyond safe limits. The source was, disturbingly, the very food meant to sustain them. The 16,000 tins had been hastily soldered with toxic lead, leaking into meals over months. Many cans were also improperly cooked or sealed, allowing mold and botulism to fester. Worse still, the desalination systems designed to provide fresh water were also lined with lead pipes. rapidly in salt water, leaching poison into every sip. This alone was deadly, but further studies revealed that severe zinc deficiency, caused by the lack of fresh food, may have triggered a breakdown of the crew's own bones, releasing stored lead into their bloodstreams. The result was mass poisoning. The expedition hadn't just stalled, it was quietly killing itself from the inside out. And the worst part? The most terrifying parts of their fate hadn't even begun yet. Trapped in ice, the fatal decisions of the Franklin expedition. As the Franklin expedition pushed deeper into the Arctic, a deadly combination of factors, lead poisoning, zinc deficiency, poor nutrition, and contagious disease, quietly took hold. The situation was made worse by a chilling realization. 5 sailors who had been discharged early in Greenland were found to have tuberculosis, suggesting that the disease had already boarded the ships before they ever reached the Canadian archipelago. Still unaware of the scale of their misfortune, the expedition pressed southward in 1846 toward what was then an uncertain landmass, King William Island. If it was an island, then sailing along the east might have led them to open water. But Franklin, opting for what seemed like the safer and more direct route, chose to go west, unknowingly guiding both ships into one of the most ice-choked corridors on Earth. On September 12, 1846, Erebus and Terror were sealed into the pack ice west of King William Island, where shifting floes and bitter cold formed an inescapable tomb of frozen water. Meanwhile, back in Britain, Lady Franklin grew increasingly concerned. One winter in the ice was expected, but two? She pressured the Admiralty for answers, and when none came, she took her plea to the public. She even enlisted famed writer Charles Dickens, who used his celebrity to rally support for a rescue. But as the British public debated, the men trapped in the ice were deteriorating. Unknown to them, their canned fruits, meant to stave off scurvy, had likely lost their vitamin C due to poor sealing and chemical breakdown. The effects wouldn't be immediate, but when they arrived, they were devastating. In May 1847, still believing rescue or thaw was imminent, a small group crossed the ice to King William Island, leaving behind 2 identical letters in stone cairns. Signed by officers and written in Captain Fitzjames's hand, the messages read, "All well," but nothing could have been further from the truth. That summer, the ice never melted. Modern studies confirm that 1845 to 1859 marked the peak of a particularly cold climatic period, one of the most frigid in 1,000 years. The ships remained entombed, and the psychological toll began to break the men. Terror began to list heavily, forcing the remaining crew to abandon it for Erebus, where they consolidated heat and rations. Terror became a makeshift morgue, storing both excess supplies and mounting bodies. Then, on June 11, 1847, Sir John Franklin, commander of the expedition, died in the ice. With no commander and no thaw in sight, morale and health collapsed. Doctors aboard had begun to recognize the symptoms of scurvy, lead poisoning, and possibly botulism. But in a land where plants couldn't grow, and even the animals carried diseases foreign to Europeans, there was little hope. The Inuit, who had evolved over generations to survive these dangers, could withstand botulism type E, a strain unique to the cold. But to the men of the Royal Navy, even a poorly cooked piece of seal meat could mean death. By the winter of 1847 to 1848, after a year of silence, the British Admiralty finally responded. Lady Franklin's relentless campaigning had worked, but by the time rescue parties were dispatched, it was already too late. The ice had claimed not just ships, but the lives, sanity, and legacy of 129 men whose fate would haunt the Arctic for generations. The final march, death on the ice. By early 1848, it was no longer a question of survival aboard the ships, it was a question of how to die. As the British Admiralty reluctantly launched rescue missions from both ends of the Northwest Passage and overland, The men trapped in the ice already knew that help, if it came at all, would be far too late. Among those dispatched was James Ross, a close friend of Francis Crozier and one of the very men who had declined to lead the Franklin expedition himself. Now, haunted by that decision, Ross sailed aboard HMS Enterprise, hoping to save those he had once turned away from guiding. The Admiralty even offered massive rewards, £20,000 for anyone who aided the mission, a sum worth millions today, and £10,000 for any information at all. But back in the Arctic, the men could wait no longer. On April 25, 1848, a grim update was scribbled in the margins of the earlier note left at King William Island. Sir John Franklin was dead. 9 officers and 15 crew had also perished. The ships had been abandoned just days earlier, and 105 survivors, under Captain Crozier, were preparing to march 240 kilometers on foot toward Back River, hoping to reach the nearest trading station. After 17 months frozen in place, they had run out of time, food, and hope. The crew was malnourished, their bodies weakened by years of scurvy and lead poisoning, their minds fogged, and their chances slim. Worse still, they weren't just walking. They were dragging with them massive 8,000-pound lifeboats filled with supplies, tools, and whatever hope they could carry. With no roads, uneven pack ice, and sharp limestone terrain beneath them, they were forced to haul these boats across sledges, through brutal winds, under an indifferent sky. It was a death march. Over 20 bodies would later be found in shallow graves or simply abandoned on the coasts of King William Island, where the weakest were left behind. Yet the march wasn't a single line of soldiers trudging south. It fractured. Groups broke away, whether by choice, confusion, or desperation. Some turned back to the ships, where they knew food, fuel, and shelter remained. Others took different coastal paths, trying parallel routes to salvation, and against all odds, some kept going. Later, unopened cans would be discovered aboard both wrecks and at multiple campsites, suggesting that the crew may have come to fear their own food more than starvation. Then, in the summer of 1849, something unexpected may have happened. Inuit oral histories describe seeing a 3-masted ship drifting free in open water, likely Erebus finally released from the ice. They claim to have seen white men hunting caribou with guns and pikes, accompanied by a strange non-Inuit dog, perhaps Neptune, the expedition's dog. These are details the Inuit could not have fabricated, as they matched what no outsider could have known. Yet by 1850, another Inuit group came across a ship still stuck in the ice, its stove burning and bodies still tucked in their bunks, suggesting that some of the men had returned, clinging to the last remnants of normalcy. That summer, the march south disintegrated further. A large portion of the survivors died in a desolate place, now known as Starvation Cove. Others scattered along the coast and into the frozen interior, reaching as far as Chantry Inlet. One Inuit account tells of a group of 4 men, barely alive. Strangely, only one showed signs of starvation, as though he had survived off the others. This was no longer a story of exploration. It had become a mosaic of isolated deaths, broken hope, and desperate last decisions. The Franklin expedition, once celebrated as the pinnacle of British ambition, had dissolved into fragments scattered across the Arctic, each one telling a slightly different story of the same slow, bitter end. The last clues of the Franklin expedition, it was later revealed that one of the final survivors had refused to engage in cannibalism. The Inuit took him and the remaining men in, offering food and what care they could spare. But even then, one of the group succumbed to disease before the others were well enough to continue. Meanwhile, in August of 1850, the first 3 graves were discovered on Beechy Island, the earliest solid evidence that something had gone horribly wrong. These were among the first crew members to die, long before the rest began their trek south. With this grim confirmation, and under growing pressure from Lady Franklin and the public, the British Admiralty committed more resources than ever, not to find the passage, but to find the men. No fewer than 11 ships were dispatched that year, with more to follow. Some of these rescue vessels would never return. One such ship, HMS Resolute, was abandoned and later recovered by an American whaler. Wood from the ship would eventually be used to construct the Resolute desk, a gift to the US President, now a permanent fixture in the Oval Office. Ironically, during the search for Franklin, HMS Investigator under Robert McClure became the first vessel to complete the Northwest Passage, but it too would become icebound and abandoned after 2 brutal winters. Rescued only by a combined party from Resolute, it served as yet another reminder that it wasn't just Franklin's men. The Arctic itself devoured even the most prepared explorers. Of the original crew, the furthest any known survivors made it was to Chesterfield Inlet on Hudson Bay, traveling in a collapsible boat. But even that wasn't far enough. Inuit accounts recorded over the next decade suggest that as late as 1850, as many as 40 men were still alive and heading south. By the next year, only 4 remained, walking, starving, no longer pulling boats. Most likely all were dead by the end of 1851, and despite the critical value of Inuit testimony, it was largely dismissed by British authorities. That would be a costly mistake. In 1854, Scottish explorer John Rae encountered a group of Inuit who offered physical evidence, brass buttons and other relics, and described a scene of mass death and cannibalism. They claimed to have discovered a site with 30 corpses, some dismembered, others partially cooked. Rae believed them, but his report was rejected outright by Victorian society. The public was unwilling to accept that their heroes had died eating one another, and Charles Dickens himself wrote scathing rebuttals to defend the honor of the empire. As a result, Inuit accounts were ignored for over a century, and yet, time and again, their stories proved consistent in key details, even if imperfectly translated or recalled. Some groups claim to have seen Crozier alive as late as 1852, possibly even 1858. Whether the dates were accurate or not, the sightings hint at a prolonged and fragmented end. It wasn't until 1858, 13 years after the expedition set sail, that another search team, funded by Lady Franklin, recovered the final written messages, tucked into a cairn on King William Island. This confirmed Franklin's death, the abandonment of the ships, and the desperate march south. But still, the full picture remained elusive. Then in 1869, American explorer Charles Francis Hall, on his second of 3 Arctic expeditions, met another group of Inuit who told a familiar story. They had tried to help the starving white men, but there were simply too many. Feeding their own families meant turning their backs on the dying, and while this devastated Hall, it only furthered the British public's resentment of the Inuit, an unfair scapegoat for a tragedy of empire and hubris. Finally, in 1993, nearly 150 years after the Franklin expedition vanished, a team located the expedition's final campsite. Forensic evidence confirmed what Rae and the Inuit had long said. The remains were covered in knife marks, limbs had been severed, bones cracked open for marrow. The truth was no longer deniable. Even now, we still haven't found the majority of the crew, but new discoveries are changing that. In 2014, the wreck of HMS Erebus was located in Crampton Bay, just off the Adelaide Peninsula, exactly where the Inuit had said it would be. Then, in 2016, HMS Terror was found, remarkably preserved in Terror Bay, a location named long before anyone knew the ship had come to rest there. Plans for full archaeological exploration were scheduled for 2020, but delayed, like everything else, by the global pandemic. In May of 2022, those efforts finally resumed. And as more artifacts and remains are recovered from these underwater tombs, we inch closer to understanding what really happened in the final days of the Franklin expedition, a story that once seemed like heroic failure, but now reads more like a slow and agonizing unraveling of men caught between their dreams and the merciless cold.